It begins with Sharon Elizabeth Burke, who's a student in the European Institute at Florence, and working on interwar Pan-Africanism in relation to European diplomacy, which sounds very interesting and serious. Second, we have Peter Fraser from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Peter, if I can put it like that, is an old hand. We used to be colleagues, and I've spent my life learning about the Caribbean from Peter, so he will illuminate us, I think.
That's why he knows so little.
I thought I knew rather a lot. And then we'll finish with Nigel Carter, who studied Caribbean history at North London University, who did an MA in public history, currently doing a PhD, part-time PhD, I think, at London Met, and is a community development worker for the rest of your life, really. I mean, what I mean is when you aren't doing your PhD. So there we have it, folks. Let's make a start now with Sharon, please. Thank you very much.
So I should probably say at this stage that my doctoral research has changed slightly. And I'm now working on the role of the Pan-African historical consciousness in anti-colonial ideology from 1920 to the 1960s, including the post-colonial period. So this research, which includes a study of James' work, argues that historical research as counter-memory lay at the heart of Pan-African anti-colonial debates in the interwar and post-war periods. Historically conscious thinking allowed both Negritude and Pan-African intellectuals to recreate lost histories as a means to reject the imperial historicist gaze, and also to draw kind of transhistorical parallels between the diasporic past and the continental present. So with this in mind, I would like to make a case for James' historical literature as a product of Pan-African thought, bearing in mind the field of history as an intellectual battleground on which anti-colonial struggles took place. So I will approach the question of the Black Jacobins as a Pan-African product from two angles. Firstly, there is the question of James as a product of and producer of Pan-African history. James, as I perceive him, made history in a twofold sense, meaning he reconstructed the past whilst actively constructing a Pan-African future, and he was not alone in this pursuit. This historically conscious Pan-African trend was both revolutionary and deeply political. More importantly, it was an intellectual phenomenon produced by figures largely from a linguistically and continentally divided diaspora, who may or may not have been aware of each other's intellectual footprints. Secondly, I will interrogate the content of the Black Jacobins, the literary or rhetorical style in representing a historical truth, and James' own place in the landscape of Pan-African literature. Language and origin and the trans-Caribbean elements in the narrative of the slave revolution cannot be overlooked. The treatment of violence is also an issue that I don't think we can skirt around in these 2 days. And it's also a significant point of comparison with other historians of revolutionary moments. Does James conflict with imperial historians on the justification of violence on anti-colonial grounds? How do we compare James to non-Marxist Pan-African thinkers, whose historical remembrance is more akin to the mourning of the past than the pursuit of a justification for revolutionary violence? Can James be viewed within the context of interwar New Negro literature, perhaps, in accordance with the representation of masculinity, rebirth through self-emancipation, and redemptive violence? Does James' own personal conflict between the necessary bloodshed of revolutionary Marxism and the Pan-African remembrance of experienced violence appear within the narrative? We must bear in mind whether his conflicting alliances to different ideologies impacted on his ability to represent historical truth. I hope to raise questions related to the indeterminable pull of the past to politically active Pan-African intellectuals, whether historians or post-colonial theorists. I will approach this work as a product of intellectual resistance to the imperial histories of African and diasporic pasts, and more importantly, resistance which had a deep impact on anti-colonial theory and practice. We might deem James' work a step in the decolonization of history, or the employment of égo-histoire is a form of post-colonial shield against the ever-present danger of recolonization, physical or ideological, or simply a Marxist exercise in revolutionary theory. However, the main point that I would like to make here is that this historical consciousness reached far beyond James' work and was a Pan-African medium for anti-colonialism from Africa to the Caribbean. So it is difficult to encapsulate in a few words the appeal to the past among Pan-African intellectuals and artists in the 20th century. The trend of Ethiopianist, backwards-glancing art and poetry, for example, ran high among the new Negro artists of the Harlem Renaissance, Negrismo, and Negritude movements. Interpretations of the grandeur of former Egyptian empires set beside conflicting portrayals of the collective experience of slavery in the Caribbean can be seen in the work of artist Aaron Douglas, for example, whilst poet Claude McKay idealized the ancient African empires which had once humbled slaves of their own when all the world was young with pregnant night, end of quote. It is clear that Pan-African art, music, and literature were and still are alternative mechanisms for remembering the histories forgotten by the discerning imperial historicist gaze. However, my focus here today is not on art or in poetry, but on the polemic and political qualities of historical literature which seduced both anti-colonial campaigners and the utopian carriers of memory to which Aimé Césaire once referred. The space of Black Britain, as Gilroy terms it, produced 20th century Pan-African thinkers who were at once historians and political commentators, from James to George Padmore to Walter Rodney to Eric Williams, and I could go on. However, this is a phenomenon reaching beyond the imperial metropole of Britain. We must embrace Senegalese historians such as Cheikh Anta Diop and historically conscious thinkers such as Léopold Senghor, for example, or Patrice Chamoiseau, whose civilizational historicism restored a kind of post-colonial dignity to the image of Africa past. We might even go as far as to suggest that anti-imperial historicism permeated anti-colonial sentiment and ideology beyond Pan-African circles, and we could hold the alternative subaltern world histories presented by Nehru as an example of this. This historically conscious trend among anti-colonial intellectuals gained global traction during the interwar period and evoked not only alternative historical meta-narratives to those of the imperial modernizing or civilizing gaze, but a way of representing, depicting, and temporarily ordering the past, which was not solely in the service of institutional imperial historicism. What is significant, and what is often overlooked by historians focused on intellectual and political movements in the metropole, is that many of these historians and thinkers were born, raised, and partially or completely educated in the colonial Caribbean, both Francophone and Anglophone, where Pan-African thought differed outstandingly to that of North America. We cannot bypass the question of the Caribbean as a simultaneously colonized and diasporic space, where questions of indigeneity, for example, and cultural authenticity ran alongside Marxist anti-colonial thinking. While Haitian revolutionary history is at the heart of much of 20th century Pan-African art and thought, Haiti's own anti-colonial movement resisted American occupation in the interwar period, whilst Francophone Martinique remained central to the historically conscious ideologies with an array of negritude writers. I think I've already mentioned Aimé Césaire. And Trinidad gave birth to Marxist activists and writers from George Padmore to our own C.L.R. James. What is the significance of the Caribbean colonial experience, where a historically displaced diaspora took stock of the legacy of slavery and settler colonialism to form group remembrance at direct odds with imperial histories? What is distinctively Pan-African about Caribbean spaces which embrace both anti-colonial Marxism and multilingual créolité, whilst still maintaining its transhistorical link with the perceived space of diasporic origin, Africa? Chamoiseau, the Martinican thinker and writer, once wrote of the Pan-African past, "Our history is not totally accessible to historians. Their methodology restricts them to the sole colonial chronicle. Our chronicles behind the dates, behind the known facts, we are the words behind the writing. I suggest that we might make greater sense of James' work as an attempt to visibilize these words behind the writing. It is up to the historian, however, to decide whether James' particular method of visibilizing was as Pan-African as a past to which he was appealing. He strove in both the Black Jacobins and memorably in A History of Pan-African Revolts to decolonize the public role of the historian and to make sense of the relationship between historicist knowledge and presentist power, and to forge a historical narrative divorced from these colonial chronicles along the revolutionary trajectory of Marxist historicism. In A History of Pan-African Revolts, for example, James brings us a determinism which at once sets out the historical narrative and defines his own incentives for exploring a Pan-African past. He tells us, the history of the Negro in his relation to European civilization falls into two divisions: the Negro in Africa and the Negro in America and the West Indies. Up to the 80s of the last century, only 1/10 of Africa was in the hands of Europeans. Until that time, therefore, it is the attempt of the Negro in the Western world to free himself from his burden which has political significance in Western history. Here James connects the longue durée of anti-colonial revolution in Africa with the trajectory of slave revolts in the colonial Caribbean and the Americas, alternating between Marxist thinkers such as Jean Jaurès and Pan-Africanists Padmore and Marxist Garvey. This is a similarly clear thread throughout the Black Jacobins. James connects themes of exploitation and territorialism via a distinctly Marxist materialist approach. And he tells us that the blacks of Africa are more advanced, nearer ready than were the slaves of San Domingo, directly associating past with present. Furthermore, in A History of Pan-African Revolts, James dismissed experience difference under the colonial rule of fascist or democratic European imperial nation states, rejecting their claims completely to any form of moral compass which constituted historical or civilizational superiority. The significance of rejecting Europe's claim to a moral high ground in a universal historical landscape cannot be overlooked. Indeed, it is a central theme in many Pan-African revisionist histories, such as Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. James' approach seems at once Pan-African and a variation of the global anti-colonial turn to history and historicism as a kind of intellectual framework for political mobilization. In this sense, it shares not only Marxist class consciousness, but a profound race consciousness in common with Pan-African thought, particularly visible in the text of the Black Jacobins, to which I will now turn. On first reading the Black Jacobins as a kind of concurrently historical, literary, and rhetorical text, the reader is struck by the overwhelmingly and quintessentially British approach to Francophone Caribbean revolutionary history. It differs extraordinarily from Aimé Césaire's, for example, post-colonial Toussaint Louverture, La Révolution Française et le Problème Colonial, which was published in 1960. And this takes on the task of the revolution as both a literary and ideological challenge in the post-Marxist sense. In James' Black Jacobins, however, a narrative of developing militarism and collective thinking is woven around intermittent glimpses of the traditional man behind the movement, the reimagined great man or thinking soldier. The perplexed reader questions whether the story that James is telling us is a departure from the great tradition of British Whig historicism, and its rallying calls for revolution channeled through the mouths of its historical agents. The critical reader at once challenges James' reconstruction of historical events by questioning his intentionality as a metropolitan Black British intellectual, simultaneously collaborating with and challenging the contemporary imperial gaze. It is our role as readers, equipped with the historicist third eye, to subject James' historical literature to the critical thinking which defies the historian's emotional involvement in a historical landscape, whilst daring them to rehumanize and to personalize their historical subjects. So will we conclude that James belongs to the overpopulated ranks of military historians, his political patriotism leaning instead towards a contemporary Pan-African nation with or without a state? Or will we conclude that James' employment of Haiti's revolutionary past as a kind of living recreation of the Pan-African dead, those who are twice invisibilized through the revolutionary necessity of their death and empire's historical amnesia, will we conclude that this was an expression of disenchantment with the Pan-African present? The question of leadership and revolutionary violence is invariably the fulcrum of James' Black Jacobins, for he is not only telling us a story, he is making a polemic and presentist argument for the Pan-African Revolution. Colonial San Domingo serves merely as a rhetorical stage upon which James roots his argument and builds his premises. Who becomes invisibilized in James' narrative? Whom does he send to the shadows of history by choosing to shine his spotlight onto some? When James refers to 150 years of historic and scientific study of revolution begun by Marx and Engels and amplified by Lenin and Trotsky, he reveals again his intentionality and honors the great men of history. In doing so, he bypasses these people whom he intermittently refers to in terms of difference, racial or sexual, and whom remain simply people, necessary to the story, yet not worthy of naming a further inquiry. There is without doubt an aspect of continuity between the selective imperial historicist gaze and the anti-colonial historicist gaze, where remembrance becomes functional, and that which does not serve its purpose is abandoned in the legendary Marxist dustbins of history. However, James' analysis is imbued with the spirit of an abstract Pan-African socialism. He tells us it was a war not so much of armies as of the people. It was a war with racial divisions emphasizing the class struggle, blacks and mulattoes against whites. At this point, James departs from his previous focus on leadership and top-down narrative, and he finds a presentist intersection between race and class on which to focus his gaze, transforming one history of local and global revolt into a Marxist political commentary. He tells us, today as then the great propertied interests and their agents commit the most ferocious crimes in the name of the whole people and bluff and browbeat them by lying propaganda. Furthermore, James historicizes revolution as a product of both thought and action, nudging us towards his presentist solution. The oppressed peoples must turn to the recent or distant past to find inspiration, motivation, and mobilization, just as the San Domingo slaves followed the example of the bread-deprived peasants in Paris. But for the revolution, and I quote, this extraordinary man and his band of gifted associates would have lived their lives as slaves, serving the commonplace creatures who owned them, standing barefooted and in rags to watch inflated little governors and mediocre officials from Europe pass by as many a talented African stands in Africa today. The message is clear. Colonized peoples must turn to their reconstructed histories beyond the imperial gaze to the words behind the writing to find an inspiration for the anti-colonial revolution. James is telling us that history is not a mere representation of past realities, nor is the Black Jacobins a mere exercise in remembrance. Haiti is a point of change along the historical trajectory of the diaspora and bears significance in the contemporary context of colonial Africa. At this point, the Pan-African character of James' narrative becomes clear, and the diaspora's exile and enslavement is merged with the colonized continent's oppression. Undoubtedly, James is taking us through the finer points of a revolution also raised in a history of Pan-African revolt, because he believed it worthy of greater awareness in contemporary Marxist and Pan-African circles. On this note, I would like to conclude my paper. Perhaps it is better not to think of James setting a kind of theatrical stage for the performance of historical change, but of his focus on historical justice and injustice in a courtroom where he personally bears witness against his adversaries. Yet James reminded us that he was not a mere bystander at the edge of the Pan-African past and posited himself as moral judge and jury within the court of history. James was not merely raising our awareness of the San Domingo experience and the transnational spread of the French Revolution. He is pointing us towards some historical parallel, or transhistorical parallel, in his own interwar context, by repeated references to the socialist movement, the anti-fascist war in Spain, and the growing threat of Nazism in Europe, all of which are and were inextricably linked to the trajectory of anti-colonial movements in Africa and the diaspora. James entered the field of revolutionary history not as a bystander, but as a retrospective participant, ready to employ the Marxist rationale for revolutionary violence and defend the Pan-Africanized memory of these black Jacobins. More importantly, it is not the historicist quality of the San Domingo Revolution, which James emphasized, but the Pan-African transhistorical experience of the African peoples and the diaspora as its continuum. Thanks.
I'm probably one of the few people at this conference who is not primarily interested in C.L.R. James, but actually interested in the 19th and 20th century British Caribbean intellectuals. And hence today, after the failure of 21st century technology, I intend to return you to the 19th century. I think what was important about James, and it resonates with a number of points made by a number of people, I'll deal specifically with his Trinidadian background. Trinidad was unusual in that it was a crown colony which in a sense dispossessed everybody of political power except the British colonial officials. It was also a society which had a French Creole elite, educated, a colored elite which derived from the French thing. It had been a Spanish colony but really been settled by the French, who were also educated. And increasingly in the 19th century, there were groups of people in Trinidad, black people in Trinidad, who cocoa, etc., allowed to get enough income to send their children abroad. So the first element in the long complaints about Trinidadians in the 19th century is that thing about having no political power. And it stands in stark contrast to elsewhere in the Caribbean, where in a sense up to 1865, when Governor Eyre gets rid of the Legislative Assembly in Jamaica, there are assemblies elsewhere. And then Crown Colony government gets, and the Trinidadians are arguing all the time, we should actually have some power. Hence, in a sense, the point Bill Schwartz makes, I think, about for any Trinidadian, the primacy of the political. The second aspect is that if you look, and I promised Bill to only speak for 10 minutes, so I will actually just concentrate on this aspect. If you actually look at some of the works that appeared in 19th century Trinidad, let's focus on two. One is J.J. Thomas's Fruitacity, which is a reply to the great English historian Froude's book about the West Indies, where he attacked Haiti and the competence of black people to govern themselves. The other one is Frederick Alexander Durham's The Lone Star of Liberia, which actually talks about going back to Africa and building up Sierra Leone as a place where black people could actually live, although Sierra Leone was a colony, actually do something back in Africa, and the importance of that. The other importance of those two books, which I want to stress, is that Thomas's work is very like James in that it is, if you like, a work of prose without statistics. It belongs to that 19th century tradition of writing history, and as we heard from one of the previous speakers, when James says art is timeless but technology fades, is dated, James is firmly on the side of art. Durham's book is full of statistics because he's proving that Haiti actually had been doing quite well. And in many ways it had been doing well in the 19th century, despite the huge compensation it had to pay to France and all kinds of other things. And he's looking at other small-sized countries and making those sort of comparisons. Padmore's The Struggle of the Negro Toilers, etc., is full of statistics. So in a sense, in the 19th century, we see, if you like, learning and understanding the world through history, which in the 19th century was mostly prose and very little statistics in history. And if you like, the positivist side, which was we were beginning to see that in the sociologist. And in this, I will uncontroversially include Marx as one of the sociologists, where the numbers and all of these surveys, etc., make sense. The other thing, and I will end with this, is that I think when James engaged with history, and this is part of what Bobby finds about the black Jacobins, I think it's not simply the mentality of a slave. When he engages with Caribbean history, he is actually much better than when he engages in British history, for instance. We were at the Glasgow conference where people pointed out the flaws in the chapter on W.G. Grace, the historical flaws, in a sense. And for instance, around that time, I managed to get hold of the book that James mentions in Beyond the Boundary, Maurice Maple's book on a history of football, where she says it's a sort of model for what he's doing. Maple's book, which he had read before he had finished that history, is actually very, very sophisticated about how the public school ethic rises and falls quite rapidly, that there are enormous critics of it. The James's view, in a sense, of British history is a view of colonial. His view of the French Revolution history, however, is rather good, because, of course, if you were a Marxist worth anything, you actually studied revolutions, because that was how you avoided mistakes in the future. Well, we know where that ended up. But anyway, that was the belief that you study them. So he actually knows a lot about the French Revolution. And one of the things I find best, and I think it's a better book than Beyond the Boundary, is how he relates those things. And how, in a sense, as Bobby says, the mentality of slaves, people standing up for themselves. But of course, the other characteristic which was touched on the previous thing was, of course, his attitude towards women. And I think the great change in James's work comes because the arguments in the Caribbean about democracy were not actually ever about democracy, they were about voting and representation. It's Caribbean thinkers, and one that I'm looking at myself, a man called Maloney, Trinidadian, whom nobody knows about, not even I, who am studying him, because his papers have sort of disappeared mysteriously, but his books are there. He too is enormously interested in democracy. As James becomes interested in democracy, in collaborative work, in better understanding women, as was suggested in the thing, by being told what to do. And of course, it is through this collaborative work which fails him in that chapter Beyond the Boundary, where he talks about aesthetics and cricket, because without his collaborators, James really didn't understand philosophy. But then, hardly anybody else did in the 19th or early 20th century Caribbean. In fact, the fellow I write about, Maloney, probably wrote the first philosophical work by a black West Indian, came out in 1914, was about ethics.
This presentation looks at the link, explores the link between C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins and a history of Negro Revolt, a history of Pan-African Revolt. So hopefully I'll be able to give some signposts in the short time of 20 minutes, which I've got. Okay, so beginning with a quote. Obviously we can see the front cover of History of Negro Revolt, and that's the Race Today Collective's 1985 publication of History of Negro Revolt by C.L.R. James. And here's a quote from Robin D.G. Kelly in the subsequently 1969 publication of Pan-African, A History of Pan-African Revolt by C.L.R. James. And Robin D.G. Kelly says, A History of Negro Revolt was a collective endeavor a product of specific political campaigns, debates, and intellectual exchange with some of the leading black radical thinkers of the 20th century. It is not just another history book, it is a historical document in its own right. So, going on and exploring the link between these two important books, Black Jacobins, written in 1938, and A History of Negro Revolt, again written in 1938, and published just after the Black Jacobins was published. So, Paul Gilroy in his book Between Camps referring to C.L.R. James's chapter on Marcus Garvey in A History of Negro Revolt, describes C.L.R. James's book as, quote, a political and theoretical coda to the Black Jacobins. And that, just for those of us who are musically inclined, the coda is the concluding passage of a piece or moment which forms an addition to the basic structure. And I think that analogy, that metaphor Paul Gilroy's, is a really useful way to consider the link, the relationship between the Black Jacobins and A History of Pan-African Revolt, bearing in mind they were both written at very closely at the same time. So, writing in the 1984 to the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James states, quote, the book was written not with the Caribbean, but with Africa in mind. And C.L.R. James goes on to add that I was tired of reading and hearing about Africans being persecuted and oppressed in Africa, in the Middle Passage, in the USA, and all over the Caribbean. I made up my mind that I would write a book in which the Africans, or people of African descent, instead of constantly being the object of other people's exploitation, would themselves be taking action on a grand scale and shaping other people to their own needs. So this underpinning of C.L.R. James coming to write the Black Jacobins and A History of Pan-African, or A History of Negro Revolt is in a way something that Chinwezu refers to as the decolonization of the African mind. So moving on to 1935 and Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. What was the impact of the Mussolini Italian invasion of Ethiopia, given that we're talking about the Pan-African developing Pan-African consciousness during this time, during the 1920s and the 1930s. So the impact of Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, Peter Fryer reminds us in Staying Power that following the 1885 Berlin Conference and the Scramble for Africa, and prior to post-colonial independence, Ethiopia and Liberia were in the whole of Africa the only territories not under European control. Mussolini invaded Ethiopia on the 3rd of October, on 3rd of October 1935, and at the time C.L.R. James was an advisor on colonial issues for the Independent Labour Party. With the Italian invasion looming, C.L.R. James founded the International African Friends of Abyssinia and Ethiopia. So, other leading members of the IAFA were Amy Ashford Garvey, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, I.T.A. Wallace-Johnson, and Ras McKinnon. And these British-based Pan-Africanist radicals campaigned against Mussolini's invasion and also European imperialism, British and French imperialism in particular. So, the two images here, Historic War and Peace, a speech by Emperor Haile Selassie. This was given, this speech 22nd of January 1940, and this is actually a flyer that was given to me, a flyer publicising a reggae dub dance. It was given to me outside Metropolitan University by somebody promoting the dance. This was this spring, around about April time. I was given this flyer, and then next to the flyer, and again the flyer obviously is showing even now the historical resonance of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in terms of if we think of Horace Campbell's Rasta and Resistance from Marcus Garvey to Walter Rodney. The image next to the flyer is Dr. Harold Moody's journal, The Keys, the official organ of the League of Coloured Peoples. And C.L.R. James wrote for the Keys, in an article during the time of the Italian invasion, C.L.R. James, writing in Harold Moody's journal, The Keys, noted that Africans and people of African descent, especially those who have been poisoned by British imperialist education, needed a lesson. They have got it. Every succeeding day shows exactly the real motives which move imperialism in its contact with Africa, shows the incredible savagery and duplicity of European imperialism in its quest for markets and raw materials. Let the lesson sink in deep. And that article was entitled Abyssinia and the Imperialists, and it was written in 1936. And so this is the front cover of Carol Polgrove's recent study. I think about 2007 this book was published under the title Ending British Rule in Africa, the subtitle Writers in a Common Cause. And as you can see the front cover. On the front cover is the image of the journal International African Opinion, which was the journal of the International African Service Bureau, with its famous motto, Educate-Co-operate-Emancipate, nothing neutral in terms of Africa. So in March 1937, the IAFA was replaced by, or evolved into the International African Service Bureau, with George Padmore as the chair and C.L.R. James editing the IASB's monthly journal, International African Opinion. And as we said earlier, the journal's motto was Educate, Cooperate, Emancipate. And Peter Fry comments, it was to be a journal for activists, not a literary paper giving advice from ivory towers. And it sought not to dominate other black organizations. And this is interesting. It sought not to dominate other black organizations, but to coordinate and centralize their activities so as to bring them into closer fraternal relation. And so here we can see, this is the front cover of a book looking at the work and the scope of the work and breadth of work of George Padmore. The book is entitled George Padmore, Pan-African Revolutionary. It's published by Ian Randall Publishers, Ian Randall Books, a Caribbean publisher, under the Caribbean Reasonings imprint. And there's a fantastic essay in this book under the title of George Padmore and C.L.R. James, International African Opinion, by Matthew Quest. The article by Matthew Quest, or the essay by Matthew Quest, it gives a really good overview, highlighting the Pan-Africanist breadth and range of the journal, which was edited by C.L.R. James, International African Opinion. And again, Robin D.G. Kelly, in his essay, The World the Diaspora Made, C.L.R. James and the Politics of History, notes that under James' editorship, the journal, that's International African Opinion, actually equaled George Padmore's Negro Worker in its scope and coverage of Black World events. And remember that George Padmore journal, The Negro Worker, would be, at the time that George Padmore was embedded within the communist movement and much more closely aligned to the Soviet Union version of communism, from which he broke away. So in 1931, George Padmore published The Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers, and here Robin D.G. Kelly comments that this important book in some ways provided a model for James, a history of Negro, for James as a history of Negro revolt. And then in 1936, George Padmore published How Britain Rules Africa, followed by Africa and World Peace in 1937. And so Carol Polgroves, in her study, Ending British Rule in Africa, has this very useful kind of phrase, writers in a common cause. And she says that she informs us how the Pan-Africanist publishing community of George Padmore, C.L.R. James, Ras McKenna, Jomo Kenyatta and I.T.A. Wallace Johnson were, quote, writers in a common cause. And again, Walter Rodney, in his essay, The African Revolution, describes the activism of C.L.R. James and his fellow 1930s British-based Pan-Africanist radicals as, quote, essentially a collective venture. And again, so Walter Rodney's description of a collective venture is reflected by Carol Polgrove's study, which refers to the independent Labour Party publisher Raymond Postgate, asking George Padmore to write the material. So Postgate commissioned, in a way, George Padmore and asked George Padmore to write the material, which eventually became the History of Negro Revolt. But according to Palsgrove, Padmore had passed the job on to James in the collaborative spirit that prevailed in this group. However, Padmore worked with James to produce the manuscript. Okay, so to what extent is C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins and the History of Negro Revolt a synthesis of Pan-Africanism and Marxism? Both The Black Jacobins and the History of Negro Revolt were published 3 years after W.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction and 6 years before Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. And both of C.L.R. James's books, says Robin D.G. Kelly, quote, place black labourers at the centre of world events. And in a 1939 article, C.L.R. James, commenting on his challenge to official narrative, states, the only place where Negroes did not revolt is in the pages of capitalist historians. Okay, so here we can see a recent cover of the 1969 publication of the History of Pan-African Revolt by C.L.R. James, and this is a more recent edition of the publication, and you'll see, I'll refer to it in a little while, there's a quote from Walter Rodney on the front of the book, and we're going to just see what Walter Rodney says in his brilliant essay, The African Revolution, what Walter Rodney says about C.L.R. James's The History of Pan-African Revolt. So, Walter Rodney, discussing the significance of the history of Negro Revolt in his essay, The African Revolution, states that, quote, the book is a mine of ideas advancing far ahead of its time. One of its most significant features was its emphasis on the continuity of resistance. Its emphasis on the continuity of resistance. And so, in this regard, perhaps we need only to think of a book like Richard Gott's Britain's Empire, Resistance, Repression and Revolt, which was published last year, and which has chapter headings such as Slave Rebellions in the Caribbean, Rebellions, Revolts and Mutinies in the Caribbean, and West African Resistance. Or Robin Blackburn's recently published book, The American Crucible, Slavery, Emancipation and Human Rights. And in relation to C.L.R. James's foregrounding of the agency and self-activity of people throughout the African diaspora, Walter Rodney comments, it is interesting to note that individuals like James and Padmore never received credit or acknowledgement from later writers. The same applies to the subject of African independent churches. How come that C.L.R. James was so prescient to perceive the significance of all these African revolts when writing in 1938? Okay, moving on to the Black radical tradition. Pinpointing the scholar activist approach central to the Black radical tradition identified by Cedric Robertson in his study Black Marxism, Walter Rodney states, C.L.R. James was a participant in some of the earliest pressure groups in the metropoles urging African freedom from colonial rule in the 1930s. That is why he was capable of writing the history of Negro Revolt in 1938. And then, so moving forward into 1969, the Drum and Spear Collective, with their Centre for Black Education in Washington, D.C., established links with C.L.R. James. And those links led to the reissuing, Drum and Spear's reissuing of A History of Negro Revolt under the new title, A History of Pan-African Revolt. And C.L.R. James added an epilogue to the new edition titled The History of Pan-African Revolt, to summary 1939 to 1969. And then at this time, C.L.R. James, when he was lecturing at Federal College in Washington, D.C., gave an amazing talk titled Black Studies and the Contemporary Student. And C.L.R. James, in delivering this talk, and at this time, at the time of C.L.R. James's talk, should I say, obviously the Black Studies movement was is taking hold right across America on American campuses, and that is the focus of the study of a book by Martha Biondi called The Black Revolution on Campus, published in 2012. And she states that the Black Jacobins became required reading in the early Black Studies movement. and we heard about the Institute of the Ward of the Black Ward earlier this morning as well from Professor Robert Hill. And so to conclude, coming towards our conclusion, again here we can see a reference to C.L.R. James by Manning Marable, the late Manning Marable, who mentions his debt of gratitude to C.L.R. James and C.L.R. James' A History of Negro Revolt in his book African and Caribbean Politics from Kwame Nkrumah to Morris Bishop. Yes, the late Manning Marable mentions his debt of gratitude to C.L.R. James, and the book's first chapter also begins with a quote from A History of Negro Revolt. And in 2010, Manning Marable co-published a book entitled New Social Movements in the African Diaspora, which also reflects C.L.R. James's influence and in particular his scholar-activist approach. And so to come to a conclusion, Walter Rodney said that C.L.R. James was capable of writing A History of Negro Revolt in 1938 because of his active participation in Pan-African independence movements. And in 1969, C.L.R. James himself stated, "It is people in the midst of a struggle today who can write about Frederick Douglass and Wendell Phillips and really illuminate them. So people who are today taking part in the struggle, in the kind of struggle that Frederick Douglass and Wendell Phillips took part in, they will be able to write about them and they can understand." And that quote from C.L.R. James is from his talk Black Studies and the Contemporary Student, which he gave at Federal City College in 1969. Okay, thank you.
Very good. Thank you to our speakers indeed. It's important to have the Pan-African dimension present here. So we've heard about Pan-Africanism as an exercise in collective memory. We've been alerted to the complex 19th century roots of what we think of as the kind of heroic age of Pan-Africanism in the mid-20th century. And then we've reminded about the connections to Marcus Garvey, and then the kind of the long after history of Pan-Africanism in Rastafarianism and in Walter Rodney. And then introduced as well was a figure of Padmore, who of course is very close to James, and their lives crisscross politically and personally over many decades, and we haven't had the opportunity to talk about Padmore. So there's plenty here. We can have questions, comments, disagreements, whatever you like.
I'm Leslie James, and I'm actually working on Padmore. My question is actually for Peter Fraser. One of the things I wanted to pick up and ask if you could speak further about is the use of statistics. Because I've been thinking about this with regard to Padmore's work in Life and Struggles and in pretty much everything he does. And there's a book that came out a year or two ago by Chris Bailey called Recovering Liberties, and he's analyzing 19th century Indian anti-colonialists, and he describes what he calls a form of counter-preaching and a form of statistical liberalism. And so he expounds this idea of statistical liberalism, which he argues that a number of 19th century Indian intellectuals were engaged in as a way of compiling statistics and using them to refute the narrative of colonial rule. And I see that very much in Padmore. Well, but I'm also wondering then if this 19th century Indian liberal intellectual tradition, how could it be different or similar to or engaged with what's happening in the 19th century Caribbean?
Raj Chetty, thanks all for your presentations. And I don't know if this is only directed to Sharon, but I think others could talk about it. And it may be sort of a clarifying question maybe that I'm asking. In your talk specifically, but again, I think the other two could respond to this issue. You talk about one, James as a metropolitan black intellectual. The phrase you use, and I wrote down the note and I don't know exactly which context, but I think you were talking about it in relation to the way he was writing about histories of sort of great men. And so one question is about how you see him as a metropolitan black intellectual. Because in some ways, and again, sort of against reading that, I see him as not necessarily as metropolitan as, I mean, he is in very important ways, but at the same time is not And then the second question is the one that maybe applied to all of you. You offer a sense of Pan-Africanism as sort of transhistorical. And I think in Nigel, there's a sense also of looking at across history, Pan-Africanism and Pan-African thought. So my question is about that precisely. In what way does Pan-Africanism become transhistorical? And partly because I think I would read against the idea of it being transhistorical, mostly because of the different kinds of Pan-Africanisms, even in the same moments, perhaps. Garvey in one sense of Pan-African, Rodney a different sense of Pan-Africanism, and James perhaps a different sense, and even Padmore, even amongst them, sort of a different sense of Pan-Africanism. So maybe to ask a question about sort of a critical attention to what Pan-Africanism can mean. And in relation to that, what does it mean in a context in the Caribbean specifically, though also in Africa, when you have a huge number of Indians for whom Pan-Africanism can't mean the same thing, even if you have an important Indo-Guyanese poet like David Aberdeen writing a book of poetry called Slave Song and claiming in very important ways African history, African diaspora history as an Indo-Guyanese poet. So that sort of conceptualization of Pan-Africanism is what I'm interested in.
It's a question mainly for Peter, but it kind of also speaks to Nigel's, but more broadly. And it's just about the sort of disjuncture that you drew out between James's and Padmore's writings, in a sense that you have both writing a very kind of critical, anti-colonial kind of texts, but the kind of style, particularly Negro Toilers, which is kind of very, very dense text, as you say, but how that kind of links, or particularly given their collaboration, there's that distinction between how James is writing and how Padmore's writing, and particularly given the claim from Kelly that Negro Toilers becomes a model for Pan-African Revolt, because stylistically they're very, very different. So I was just wondering about the kind of those disconnections and connections, really.
It's just a quick question, what the panel think about James's critique of Nkrumah and whether that represents, for example, his writings on revolution in Ghana, or what happens after it, and is that a critique of Pan-Africanism in terms of its limits, that has its very positive, driving force in terms of anti-colonialism, but has its limits as personified by Nkrumah?
Okay, thanks very much. We'll move on to the panel now for responses. We'll start with Peter Sings. The first question was directed to you.
I'm not sure in the 19th century how much people like Frederick Alexander Durham actually knew about the Indian nationalists, but he actually studied in London. The book partly disappeared because it appears with his name on it, and underneath he's described and describes himself as an African, which was actually a common term in Trinidad for people to describe themselves. He then actually went off, I think, to Liberia. I'm not absolutely sure about this, but he disappears from the Inns of Court that he attended records, and then he reappears several years later in the Gold Coast as a lawyer. So he obviously lived up to his thing and decided Sierra Leone wasn't quite the place. But the cross currents of nationalism, etc., are, I think, important to say. I simply don't know. Again, Durham is somebody we know very little about. His brothers were actually involved with Sylvester Williams in forming the Pan-African Association, etc. But in Indian nationalism, as I think the point Bobby made in years and years ago in Garvey papers, for instance, was actually important to people in the Caribbean, as was, for instance, Japan's defeat of Russia. So I imagine that, given the sort of wide reading he displays in the book, he probably did know a bit about them. But I think beyond that, he had the sort of mind which went to statistics. I must read the Bailey book, thanks for drawing my attention to it. But in a sense, the point I was trying to make was that there are two sorts, if you like, probably more than that. We'll take two sorts of 19th century mind. The one that in a sense is literary and artistic, and the other one which is statistical and scientific when writing about society. And James belonged to the artistic wing, as came out of that wonderful thing about the Rodin statue. And Durham, Padmore belonged to the positivist wing, if you like.
I would agree in terms of the different streams of Pan-Africanism and different currents of Pan-Africanism over time as well. So you could think of Pan-Africanists like Edward Wilmot Blyden and Martin Delaney, who would be different types of Pan-Africanist thinkers in a different period as well to Pan-Africanists like C.L.R. James and George Padmore. And then in the, say, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, you could think of a different strain or current of Pan-Africanism in terms of negritude in the way that which was reflected in Sharon's paper, and you could think of Aimé Césaire, who would be a Pan-Africanist or influenced by Pan-Africanism, but in a different way to C.L.R. James. So I think you're quite right. It's important to be aware and investigate the different currents and streams of Pan-Africanism, and it's particularly at this time, sort of like, you know, times of quite Black History Month. You have these debates between sort of more Afrocentric versions of Pan-Africanism in contrast to, I say, a more Marxist influenced Pan-Africanism of C.L.R. James and George Padmore. So it's a very important thing that you've touched on there. Yeah.
Sharon?
I'll respond to Roger's questions. As for my definition of James as a metropolitan black intellectual, I'm not entirely sure it's accurate now, but if there was an alternative, could we define him as a provincial intellectual? He's certainly an intellectual, and not everyone from Trinidad is a C.L.R. James. He does belong to an educated elite, a literary elite. I'll move on from that.
What about cosmopolitan intellectual?
He's also an organic intellectual. He's a self-educated and self-made intellectual, so we can think of him in the Gramscian sense. As for the transhistorical, I think, to be honest, because I'm working mostly on historians are the most difficult historical subjects to historicize. And in that sense, they appear as transhistorical when they clearly are not, and they are rooted in time and space. They are products of history. But I think because, for example, Chamoiseau as well as James, they perceive of themselves as in a certain way outside of history, as kind of forgotten by history, that there is a certain transhistorical element to all of their texts. It does not mean that Pan-Africanism as an ideology, as varied as it is transhistorical in that kind of wide and abstract sense. And as for the Caribbean, it's a space of competing ideologies as well as diasporas, which is fascinating. And when you mentioned the Indian diaspora there, I was thinking of the later Créolité movement and the work of Chamoiseau, for example, and they completely blow out of the water all of the previous Pan-Africanist ideologies in the Caribbean, and they're really arguing for a kind of multicultural, kind of pluralist ideology in which anyone can buy into, and that doesn't kind of hegemonize the space of the Caribbean as a solely African diasporic space.
I think the Caribbean, in terms of just following what you just said, in terms of Pan-Africanism and other ethnic groups in the Caribbean, I think linking Pan-Africanism to notions of creolization and Creole concepts, I think, obviously that's an approach that has to be taken there, and in terms of hybridity and syncretism as well. And I think just this question about the difference in style an approach of C.L.R. James and George Padmore. I think, and in particular with Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers and a History of Negro Revolt. History of Negro Revolt is a more historical text than Life and Struggles of Negro Toilers. The shared element is that there is the agency of black labourers and black workers. That's the shared element. But the difference in style and method, one's a more historical kind of view, one is a more kind of journalistic kind of presentation. And then in terms of style, the statistics, more scientific statistical approach of George Padmore, maybe that was something in relation to George Padmore's political education in terms of his Marxist, scientific socialist, communist education. Maybe that had something to do with his approach, and even C.L.R. James kind of referred to, quite anecdotally, George Padmore's very disciplined, methodical kind of working style. And then the question about Kwame Nkrumah and Pan-Africanism as perhaps a limiting kind of political philosophy. I don't agree. I think this question was taken up by Manning Marable in the book that I highlighted, African Caribbean Politics, and both C.L.R. James in his analysis of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, and Manning Marable takes on the baton from C.L.R. James. Again, is to look at the relationship between Kwame Nkrumah as a leader and the inheritance of the colonial state and the role of the masses and the self-activity of the masses. And so, no, Pan-Africanism isn't a limiting philosophy. What's needed is the extension of the political agency of the masses. And I think that's what C.L.R. James concludes within Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, and it's a similar point that's taken on and made by Manning Marable in his African and Caribbean Politics.
Thank you, Nigel.
Any nationalism is a nightmare. Any pan-nationalism is a nightmare taken to an excessive power, because it has so many little tributaries and rivulets and everything else in it. So to expect a single definition of the what was interesting was when Ethiopia was invaded, they all came together. Even Garvey was in a sense included in that. Hence, partly answers the point about Padmore-James relationship, etc. The last thing about the large numbers of East Indians in the Eastern Caribbean is, I think that was precisely why so many Trinidadians, Adrian Kola Rienzi, who has, that real name was Krishna Dio Narayan, Padmore, James, Eric Williams, Oliver Cromwell Cox went for Marxism because it seemed somehow to be able to solve the racial problem. And the thing that that people keep on quoting from James is really not as profound as people think, but we can argue about that another day, about taking the race thing and so on and so forth. It sort of skates around the problem because it, in a sense, it's a Marxist thing saying, come the revolution, it will all be sorted out. And in fighting the revolution, you've got to be aware. And as I think, as a previous speaker pointed out, one has to remember the women. How could one forget the women? But easily done. And that was one aspect of C.L.R. James being a 19th century thing. If I'd had my tablet up, one of the points I made was the Victorian age in the West Indies went from 1838 to about 1931, 39. And James, in a sense, is a Victorian. And if you understand that about him, it is America that makes him a modern man in many ways, breaking decisively in some ways with 19th century things.
Okay, I am, however, going to take Chair's prerogative here and just say, if it's the case that historians are the hardest people to historicize, we still have to historicize them, because if we don't, we're sunk. Thank you very much.